got feelings. I got feelings for people. Like, sometimes in life, things come back.
Well, I mean, it's funny.
Everyone knows The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan never saw eye to eye. Their history was full of tension, mistrust, and silent distance. However, at the end of the day after Hogan's death, The Undertaker broke his silence with a tribute no one expected, and it left the wrestling world stunned. The tribute no one expected. No one expected The Undertaker to say anything over Hulk Hogan's body, let alone something that sounded like respect. The room was wired for nostalgia and denial, the kind of polished goodbye that papers over everything. But the dead man didn't do polished goodbyes. He didn't do long speeches, big hugs, or industry fairy tales. He walked in with the weight of 30-plus years on his shoulders and said the last thing people thought would come out of his mouth, a short acknowledgement that Hogan built a road the rest of them walked. It was not flowery, it was not warm, but it was unmistakably a tribute. And that's why it hit like a chair shot. Because here's the twist. Undertaker had spent decades being honest about Hogan while Hogan was alive. Honest in the way wrestlers aren't supposed to be about the so-called immortal. He didn't bury him with gossip. He simply refused to prop up the myth. Fans remember the podcast clips, the side-eyed comments, the "that's not how it went" energy anytime 1991 came up. They remember Undertaker watching the crowd sour on Hogan and responding with the calm of someone who'd already made his peace with the truth.
I got feelings. I got feelings for people. Like, sometimes in life, things come back.
Well, I mean, it's funny. Everybody realizes that Hogan wasn't the guy that he was portrayed to be.
So when he stood over Hogan's coffin and said, essentially, he mattered to this business, it landed as the hardest swerve imaginable. Undertaker had never chased cheap heat off Hogan's name. He didn't need to. He was the conscience of the locker room, the man who could go years without saying a word and still freeze a hallway when he finally spoke. He was also the guy who carried a scar from one very specific night, November 27th, 1991, and never forgot how it felt to be 26, crowned too soon, then made to feel like he'd broken the company's golden goose. You know the night, Survivor Series, Detroit. The Undertaker pins Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship in what should have been a coronation. Then the groans, the clutching, the whispered panic that traveled faster than the bell ever could.
As soon as my knees hit, I hear, "Oh, you got me, brother."
My neck and my back.
I'm like,
Backstage, Hogan laid out on the floor of Vince's office, EMTs circling, the whole opera of catastrophe unfolding for the new kid who thought he might have just crippled the franchise. And then, days later, when the business moved on, when the belt moved back at This Tuesday in Texas, when lesson learned felt like the real finish, Undertaker finally saw the tape. Hogan's head never touched. The seatbelt was too tight, brother. That was the news story when Undertaker confronted him in San Antonio. Not impact constriction, a jammed neck because he was held so tight he had nowhere to move. Watch the replays. Listen to how the vets talk about that week. The setup vibe, the way paranoia and politics ran the building, the way a 6-day title reign can feel like a warning label on your forehead. Undertaker has laughed at himself about being too snug on the very first tombstone he ever gave. Coco Beware nearly paid for that learning curve, but even he'll tell you straight, that wasn't the Hogan story. All these years I thought he was overreacting. Then I watched Coco back and went, damn. But Hogan, that was different. That difference is why fans were stunned when the tribute came out of Undertaker's mouth. He had every reason to say nothing. That's his style. Protect the room, protect the craft, don't escalate the myth or the mess. He had every reason to keep the ledger balanced. You did what you did, I'll do what I do. Instead, he drew a line between the man and the moment and chose, finally, to speak to the scale of Hulk Hogan, not the shape of his sins. And make no mistake, the sins were known. The boos that followed Hogan into later life appearances weren't arbitrary. Undertaker didn't cheer them, he understood them. People realize Hogan wasn't the guy he was portrayed to be, he said. Flat, measured, inevitable. Fans weren't just reacting to one scandal or one headline. They were reacting to 1,000 tiny reveals about how the machine once worked and who it worked for. They were reacting to the knowledge, finally out in the open, that the top guy's aura could be an invoice other people paid. Ask Jesse Ventura about invoices. Ask him about the night he stood on a chair and tried to unionize a locker room, about the phone call from Vince the next day, about the deposition years later when the question came up, how did you know? And the answer landed with no hesitation. Hulk Hogan told me. It's all there in Ventura's own words. The rat, the royalties, the reality that a union would have cost the company money and cost the top guy leverage. Undertaker didn't wave that story around like a trophy. He didn't have to, but he understood what it meant to every tape trader, town-to-town lifer who limped into retirement with little to show for the miles. So what changed at the coffin? Not the facts, not the tape, not the way the 1991 belt came and went like a dare. What changed was the finality. Death erases a lot of noise. It doesn't rewrite the book, but it does slam it shut. And when that book closes on someone who dragged an entire business from smoky arenas to football stadiums, there's a gravity that commands a verdict. Undertaker gave one. Hulk Hogan mattered. The booze didn't erase that. The politicking didn't erase that. The old heat didn't erase that. If anything, the respect is sharper because the history is honest. The tribute hits harder precisely because it comes from the one man who never pretended 1991 didn't happen, who never pretended the fans' disillusionment was a mystery, who never pretended the locker room didn't have a long memory. Undertaker built his power by not selling what wasn't true. That's why the room went quiet when he thanked Hogan. That's why the clip, short, almost reluctant, carved down to bone, exploded across timelines. It read as real. This is the paradox you build retention around. The critic became the eulogist. He didn't absolve. He didn't rehabilitate. He simply acknowledged, and because he acknowledged, the audience finally felt the scale of the story instead of the script of it, and it reframed the old beats. Survivor Series 1991 wasn't just a screw turned against a rookie. It was the hinge of an era, a lesson in how empires defend themselves. Undertaker's six-day reign wasn't just a statistic. It was a warning that his rise would come with terms. Ventura's discovery and deposition wasn't just tea. It was a blueprint for why people in the building revered and resented the same man at the same time. The boos on Netflix weren't just heckling, they were audit, the public finally catching up to the private ledger. In that context, Undertaker's final words feel less like a contradiction and more like a conclusion. He can be honest about the myth and still mark the monument. He can say with a voice that rarely trembles that the business many of them love was built by a man many of them struggle to like. He can call the contributions immeasurable without pretending the costs were imaginary. And if you listen closely, that's what makes the line land. Not the sentiment, but the calibration. It's the calibration that will carry. Part 2. Because once you accept that the tribute itself is the twist, you can walk back through the years and see the pattern. The cold distance, the professional run-ins, the public moments where Undertaker let uncomfortable truths breathe without turning them into vendettas. You can see why a single, careful sentence at a coffin would feel more shocking than any rant. And you can feel the message aimed past the man in the casket, straight at the audience that grew up on larger-than-life heroes. This story is bigger than who was right and who was wrong in Detroit. It's about how wrestling asks you to feel one thing while it does another, and how the few who refuse to lie, even by omission, end up holding the most expensive words. Undertaker spent a career not saying them. Then he chose the one moment where saying them would matter most. Call it a salute, call it a reckoning. Either way, it was the tribute no one expected, and the only one that could have cut through the noise. Cold distance, public backlash. If Undertaker's final words felt like a salute, it's because the distance between him and Hogan had been obvious for decades. They weren't friends. They weren't allies. At best, they were co-workers who shared a ring when the booking demanded it. At worst, they were reminders of two eras clashing, Hogan's cartoon-colored 1980s and Undertaker's darker, more grounded 1990s. That distance was never more clear than in the aftermath of Survivor Series 1991. What should have been the start of Undertaker's first true championship run lasted just 6 days. 6 days before Vince McMahon booked a rematch in Texas and handed the belt back to Hogan. Why? Because Hogan had sold an injury so convincingly that officials questioned if the rookie phenom could be trusted with the company's crown. Undertaker later admitted he carried that with him for years, the sense that his coronation was undercut not by the crowd, not by the office, but by the man he pinned. Watching the footage back decades later, he saw it clearly. Hogan's head never came close to the mat. The screams, the grimaces, the backstage drama, pure performance. That was the seed of their divide. Hogan protecting his empire, Undertaker realizing how fragile his own could be. But it wasn't just Survivor Series. The gap between them widened with every reminder of Hogan's politics. When Jesse Ventura revealed that Hogan had ratted him out to Vince McMahon for trying to unionize the locker room, it crystallized a truth many already suspected. Hogan was out for Hogan. Wrestlers talked for years about broken bodies and no retirement plans, and there it was, proof that the top guy helped kill the one chance they had at security. Undertaker didn't rant about that. He didn't need to. His silence was telling. To those who knew, the dead man's restraint around Hogan was a verdict in itself. And then came the public backlash. By the 2000s, fans who had once worshipped Hogan began to turn. UCW's collapse left his reputation scarred with stories of creative control clauses, matches sabotaged, younger stars buried. By 2015, the scandals broke wide open. Leaked recordings of Hogan using racist slurs, declaring himself a racist to a point. WE moved quickly. cutting ties and scrubbing him from history. When he returned years later, the cheers were gone. In one of the most symbolic moments, Hogan appeared on Netflix and was booed mercilessly. Undertaker's response? A shrug. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't gloating. It was recognition. The public had finally caught up to what the locker room had always known. Hogan wasn't the hero he pretended to be, and that's why Undertaker's words at Hogan's coffin carried so much weight, because they came from a man who had never shielded Hogan from criticism, who had let the truth hang in the air for decades, and who had no reason to soften when the boos started raining down. When he finally did soften, when he finally said his contributions were immeasurable, it was the rarest twist of all. Respect that only surfaced when the man was gone. That tension, that paradox, is what left the room speechless. Undertaker's tribute at Hogan's funeral mattered because it came after a career defined by distance. This wasn't Ric Flair crying over an old friend. This wasn't a tag partner remembering road trips. This was one Titan acknowledging another, without ever pretending they had been close. For decades, Undertaker and Hogan's relationship was marked not by warmth, but by suspicion. Survivor Series 1991 had been the spark, but the divide only widened in the years that followed. 10 years after Survivor Series, they crossed paths again. This time the roles had shifted. Hogan was no longer the unstoppable hero. He was the nostalgia act, riding the wave of his WrestleMania X8 showdown with The Rock. Undertaker, by then, was a made man. 10 years deep into his streak, the locker room's enforcer, the guy who didn't need Hogan to validate him. At Judgment Day 2002, Undertaker defeated Hogan for the undisputed championship. The match itself wasn't a classic. Hogan was 48, slower, visibly limited, but the symbolism was heavy. Undertaker pinning Hogan clean was more than a title change. It was the end of the Hogan era. For all the political maneuvering, all the creative control clauses, Hogan couldn't stop time. The dead man outlasted him. Even after that victory, he admitted in interviews that he always kept Hogan on his radar, a polite way of saying he didn't trust him. That distrust defined their distance. By the 2000s, Undertaker was the undisputed leader of WWE's locker room. Wrestlers' Court, an informal system of discipline, often ran under his watch. He was the enforcer of respect, making sure rookies learned the code: be humble, pay dues, protect the business. Hogan, meanwhile, had a very different reputation. In WCW, his contract granted him creative control, letting him veto finishes he didn't like. Matches that could have made new stars, Sting at Starrcade 1997 for example, were sabotaged because Hogan wouldn't lose clean. Younger talent saw him as a roadblock, not a mentor. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Undertaker used power to preserve order. Hogan used power to preserve himself. Then came the scandals. In 2015, Hogan's world imploded when tapes surfaced of him using the N-word repeatedly, declaring himself a racist to a point. WWE moved quickly, terminating his contract and erasing him from history. For 3 years, Hogan was persona non grata. When he returned in 2018, fans weren't fooled. The boos followed him everywhere. And Undertaker? He didn't defend him. He didn't excuse him. He didn't call for forgiveness. Instead, he said the quiet part out loud. For fans, that was karma. For Undertaker, it was confirmation. The personal scandals only made the picture darker. Hogan's messy divorce from Linda in 2009 aired accusations of cheating and verbal abuse. His son Nick's reckless street racing crash left a friend permanently disabled. Even his daughter Brooke distanced herself in later years. The once immortal Hogan looked increasingly mortal, surrounded by fractures. And through it all, Undertaker stayed silent. He wasn't interested in piling on, but he wasn't rushing to defend Hogan either. The silence spoke volumes. When Hogan was booed on Netflix, Undertaker's reaction summed up decades of distance. "Things come back," he said. "That's not gloating, that's judgment." A cold acknowledgement that the audience had finally caught up to what wrestlers had always known. Hogan was never the spotless hero he pretended to be. And this is why Undertaker's tribute shocked people, because it came after all of that, after Survivor Series, after the Judgment Day rematch, after the scandals, the boos, the estrangements, after a lifetime of distance. He had every reason to say nothing. Instead, he gave Hogan the one thing he had withheld for decades: public respect. Undertaker's words didn't erase history. They didn't absolve Hogan. They didn't pretend the boos never happened. But they reframed everything. By calling Hogan's contributions immeasurable, Undertaker forced fans to confront a paradox. You can despise the man, critique the choices, and still recognize the empire he built. Without Hogan, there is no WrestleMania 3. Without Hogan, there is no expansion into mainstream pop culture. Without Hogan, there is no path for The Undertaker to walk walk into. That's what made the tribute so shocking. Because if even Undertaker, the man who never shied away from Hogan's flaws, was willing to say thank you, then fans had to admit it too. The cold distance, the mistrust, the silence, the scandals, all of it built to that single sentence at Hogan's coffin. Undertaker didn't cry, he didn't ramble, he didn't embellish. He simply said the truth. The man mattered. And that truth hit harder than any denial or takedown ever could. Because if the most stoic man in wrestling was willing to close the book that way, then maybe the final word on Hogan wasn't about booze or scandals at all. Maybe it was about the scale of the myth. Bigger than the man, bigger than the mistakes, bigger than the heat. And that's where the next part begins. Undertaker's final judgment. Not just on Hogan, but on the entire business that made him possible. The final judgment. When Undertaker stood over Hulk Hogan's body and delivered words that amounted to a tribute, it wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire business closing a chapter. For 40 years, wrestling had wrestled with Hogan's contradictions, his greatness in the ring, his influence on pop culture, and the shadows that followed him outside it. Undertaker's final words cut through all of it. They were the last judgment on Hogan's legacy, and they came from the one figure in wrestling who had no reason to embellish. The symbolism couldn't have been more fitting. For decades, Hogan was marketed as the immortal. Yet in the end, it was The Undertaker, the man who personified death, who lowered the gavel on his legacy. A single line, delivered without drama, carried more force than any Hall of Fame speech or PR statement. Fans in the room that day said you could hear the silence. No coughing, no shuffling, no camera clicks. Just the dead man, standing still, speaking with a voice that had never belonged to kayfabe alone. For years, Undertaker blurred the line between character and man. But in that moment, the distinction disappeared. Mark Calloway and The Undertaker became one, and both spoke the truth. Hogan mattered, even if he was never the man people thought he was. For years, the debate over Hogan split the wrestling world. Was he a hero who put wrestling on the map, or a politician who held the business hostage? Was he the icon who filled stadiums, or the hypocrite who sold out his peers? Whole documentaries, podcasts, and shoot interviews wrestled with the question, but Undertaker's words at the coffin gave the final answer. Not because they erased the debate, but because they transcended it. He didn't pick a side. He didn't excuse Hogan's sins, nor did he erase his contributions. He simply acknowledged the paradox. Hogan was flawed, maybe fatally so, but his impact was real, lasting, and impossible to deny. And coming from Undertaker, that verdict was definitive. This was the man who never jumped on a bandwagon, who rarely spoke outside character, who only offered commentary when he believed it mattered. That restraint gave his words a weight no one else could match. There is an irony that fans can't shake. Undertaker never gave Hogan his respect in life. He didn't buddy up at conventions, didn't post nostalgic selfies, didn't call him brother for the cameras. He kept his distance, sometimes with blunt honesty, sometimes with silence that spoke louder than words. And then, in death, he gave Hogan more than Hogan's closest allies ever could. A respect that carried no agenda, no paycheck, no storyline, no backstage deal. Just a final acknowledgement that Hulk Hogan, the flawed man, the polarizing figure, the larger-than-life icon, was the foundation. That's what left fans speechless. Because in an era where everyone has an angle, Undertaker's words were the closest thing to truth. Think of how their careers mirror each other. Hogan brought wrestling to the mainstream with bright colors, catchphrases, and comic book heroism. Undertaker gave wrestling its darkest mythos, a character that proved you could be terrifying and still sell out arenas. One was light, the other shadow. One immortalized America's optimism, the other embodied mortality. For them to converge at the end, in a funeral where the dead man saluted the immortal, felt like the most poetic final act wrestling could script, except it wasn't scripted. It was Undertaker, choosing to put respect on Hogan's name when it mattered most. When Undertaker spoke at Hulk Hogan's funeral, it wasn't just one man speaking about another. It was the closing of an entire era. Hogan was gone. The immortal had proven mortal, and the dead man of all people was the one tasked with writing the epitaph. The words were simple, too simple, some fans said. His contributions were immeasurable. For that, I am thankful. That was it. No long speech, no road stories, no tears, just a final verdict. And that's why it shook people. Because when Undertaker speaks, silence follows. And silence in wrestling is rarer than any cheer. Within hours, Undertaker's tribute was replayed on podcasts, into TikToks, dissected on Reddit threads. Some praised him for finally putting respect on Hogan's name. Others accused him of being late to the party party, of waiting until Hogan couldn't answer back, but the consensus was clear. This was the only tribute that mattered. Ric Flair wept on camera, recalling how Hogan had visited him in the hospital when he nearly died. Vince McMahon called Hogan the greatest superstar of all time. Jesse Ventura, still bitter, refused to offer condolences at all. But Undertaker, he split the difference. His words weren't emotional, but they weren't dismissive either. They were surgical. He didn't ignore the flaws, but he didn't deny the impact. That neutrality carried more weight than any praise. Because Undertaker was the one man who had lived through all of Hogan's highs and lows, shared rings with him, shared locker rooms with him, and never drank the Kool-Aid. If he said Hogan mattered, then Hogan mattered. End of debate. For decades, fans argued about Hogan's legacy. Was he the hero who sold out stadiums, or the politician who buried careers? Was he the bridge to mainstream pop culture, or the anchor that dragged wrestling into scandal? Whole documentaries were made about this question. But Undertaker's tribute cut through the noise. He didn't pick sides. He didn't indulge in nostalgia, nor did he lash out. He acknowledged the paradox and left it at that. Hogan was both things, the hero and the hypocrite, the foundation and the flaw. That was the final judgment. Not absolution, not condemnation, just acknowledgement. There's a reason fans keep replaying that moment, the poetry of it all. Hogan spent his entire career selling himself as the immortal. He ripped his shirt, flexed his muscles, pointed skyward, promising Hulkamania would live forever. And yet when his body finally rested, it was the Undertaker, the man who embodied death, who lowered the curtain. The symbolism was so thick it felt scripted, except it wasn't. It was Undertaker being Undertaker. Brief, controlled, final. Hogan's immortality ended not with a scandal, not with booze, not even with his own words. It ended with a dead man telling the world the show was over. Not everyone saw it as respect. Some fans felt Undertaker's tribute was a backhanded compliment, a way of giving Hogan credit without ever forgiving him. He thanked the contributions, not the man, one fan tweeted, sparking a thread with over 20,000 replies. Others argued that the brevity was the point, that Undertaker's refusal to sugarcoat made the respect real. YouTubers churned out reaction videos overnight. Undertaker just buried Hogan with praise, one headline read. The dead man's final promo, read another. In forums, fans admitted they were more moved by Undertaker's 28 words than by the hours of eulogies from Hogan's closest friends. Because Undertaker didn't perform, he judged, and in wrestling, judgment from the dead man carries the most weight. Undertaker's words also spoke to a larger truth about wrestling itself. Its heroes rarely survive untouched. From Ric Flair's scandals to Chris Benoit's horror, from Vince McMahon's downfall to Hogan's racism tapes, the legends of one era become the cautionary tales of the next. Undertaker, by contrast, stood apart. He protected his mystique, stayed loyal to the business, and walked away with dignity. That gave him a moral authority few others had. So when he said Hogan's contributions were immeasurable, it wasn't a corporate line. It was the final verdict of wrestling's last moral compass. The Undertaker's tribute marked the true end of Hulkamania. Not Hogan's last match, not his scandals, not his erasure from WWE history. It ended when the dead man, wrestling's most respected figure, chose to thank him in death. That thank you was shocking precisely because it came from someone who had never needed Hogan, who had never pandered, who had never pretended they were close. It came from a man who had every reason to stay silent but chose not to. And in choosing to speak, Undertaker gave Hogan what no scandal could take away: immortality through acknowledgement. Undertaker's tribute wasn't for Hogan's family. It wasn't for Vince McMahon. It wasn't even for the fans. It was for history. Because now the book is closed. The immortal is gone. The dead man has spoken. And the wrestling world will never look at Hulk Hogan the same way again. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.